Jung's most disturbing discovery wasn't about empathy alone. It was about why empaths feel hate from people they've only helped, and why this phenomenon reveals the unconscious shadow dynamics that most people refuse to acknowledge about human relationships. In his work on projection and shadow psychology, Jung documented what I call helper's paradox syndrome, a pattern where highly sensitive individuals would offer genuine assistance and emotional support to others, only to encounter hostility, resentment, or rejection from the very people they'd tried to help. Jung called this pattern disturbing because these empathic individuals triggered what he described as shadow confrontation in those they helped. When empaths offered assistance, they unconsciously forced others to face their own dependency, vulnerability, and unacknowledged emotional needs, creating psychological discomfort that often manifested as hostility toward the helper. What made this discovery so significant to Jung was the predictability. He could forecast that acts of genuine empathic assistance would often trigger defensive reactions, projection, and even hatred from recipients, not because the help was unwanted, but because it activated unconscious shame and wounded pride. Today, I'll reveal Jung's insights about why empaths feel hate from people they've only helped, and why he believed this reaction exposes the shadow dynamics and projection mechanisms that govern most human relationships. The grateful patient who became an enemy. Jung's breakthrough came through a clinical case that shattered his assumptions about human gratitude. A patient had been consistently supported by a close friend during months of crisis, emotional support, practical help, unwavering presence during their darkest period. Then, the unthinkable happened. The patient began expressing intense irritation toward this helpful friend, complaints that the friend was too much, overwhelming, making me feel weak. Despite receiving only kindness, the patient started avoiding and eventually rejecting their most supportive relationship. Jung discovered something chilling through analysis. The patient's hostility wasn't about the friend's actions, but what the friend's help revealed about their own psychological state. The helper had become a mirror, reflecting their dependency, triggering shame so profound it transformed into rage against the mirror itself. Jung documented, the individual could not tolerate being witnessed in vulnerability. The helper's presence created unbearable awareness of neediness, forcing a choice between integration or projection. The psyche chose projection. What disturbed Jung most was discovering this wasn't isolated but universal, a fundamental pattern where empathic assistance activates what he called dependency terror in recipients. The friend's caring presence forced confrontation with aspects of self they'd rather deny. This case revealed that empaths become unwitting triggers for psychological material. Others desperately want to keep unconscious, making them targets for shadow projection and defensive hostility. The shadow mirror psychology. Jung uncovered the mechanism behind why genuine help triggers hatred. Empaths function as psychological mirrors that reflect recipients' disowned emotional reality, creating intolerable self-awareness that gets projected outward. Jung identified the three-stage mirror process. Stage 1, unconscious reflection. When empaths offer assistance, they naturally attune to others' emotional states and needs. This attunement creates what Jung called involuntary mirroring. The empath's responses reflect back the recipient's authentic emotional condition, bypassing their protective persona. Recipients sense being seen through in ways that feel exposing and uncomfortable, even when the empath has no intention of judgment or analysis. Stage 2, shadow activation. Jung discovered that this mirroring activates what he called disowned dependency material in recipients. Their unconscious shame about needing help, feeling vulnerable, or appearing incomplete suddenly becomes visible through the empath's caring response. Rather than integrating this normal human condition, the psyche experiences it as threatening to their self-image and attempts to eliminate the source of awareness. The empathic mirror. Stage 3. Projection defense. Jung observed that recipients often unconsciously attribute negative qualities to empaths to justify rejecting them. The helper becomes manipulative, condescending, or trying to make themselves feel superior. Projections that protect against acknowledging their own vulnerability. Jung realized this mechanism explains why empaths feel blindsided by hostility after genuine attempts to help. The hatred isn't about their actions, but about the unconscious psychological material their presence activates in others. This mirror destruction response serves to restore the recipient's psychological equilibrium by eliminating the uncomfortable reflection of their authentic emotional needs. The superiority illusion that destroys relationships. Jung identified a deeper dynamic that makes empathic help feel threatening, what he called unconscious hierarchy creation, where assistance automatically implies superiority and inferiority roles, even when neither party intends this. Jung discovered that the simple act of offering help creates what recipients unconsciously perceive as a power imbalance. The helper appears to have resources, insight, or strength that the recipient lacks, triggering what Jung called inferiority wound activation, regardless of the empath's actual intentions. This perceived hierarchy triggers several automatic responses. Pride armor activation. Recipients' egos immediately deploy defenses against feeling diminished by needing help. Jung noted that accepting assistance can unconsciously feel like regression to childhood dependency, triggering what he called dignity preservation mechanisms. These manifest as criticism of the helper's methods, motivations, or character, ways of restoring psychological equality by finding fault with the person offering assistance. Competence threat response. Jung observed that empathic assistance often triggers questioning of recipients' own capabilities. If someone else can see and address their problems, it raises unconscious doubts about their insight and problem-solving abilities. This creates resentment toward empaths for highlighting perceived inadequacies, transforming gratitude into hostility as a way of protecting self-concept. Autonomy violation. Perception. Jung documented that many experience offered help as implicit criticism of their independence. The message received becomes, "I think you can't handle this yourself," rather than, "I care about you." Recipients with strong self-sufficiency conditioning interpret empathic offers as invasive presumptions about their capabilities, triggering hostile reactions designed to reassert autonomy and competence. Jung emphasized these reactions operate largely outside conscious awareness and don't reflect recipients' actual feelings about empaths' character, but rather their own unresolved psychological material around dependency and self-worth. If you felt confused by someone's hostility after you helped them, comment, "They were fighting their own reflection." The 4 faces of helper hatred. Jung catalogued 4 distinct patterns in how people transform empathic assistance into reasons for hostility, each revealing different unconscious psychological conflicts. The pride warrior. These individuals experience any offer of help as an assault on their independence mythology. Jung observed they respond with what he called competence theater, dramatic displays of self-sufficiency designed to reject the implied inadequacy of needing assistance. Pride warriors often escalate to personal attacks on empaths' motivations, claiming helpers are trying to feel important or need to be needed. This projection allows them to maintain their independence fantasy while discrediting the source of uncomfortable awareness. Jung noted these individuals typically carry childhood conditioning where needing help equaled weakness or failure, creating adult hypersensitivity to any suggestion they might benefit from support. The shame transformer. Jung identified people who convert their internal judgment about needing help into external blame toward empaths. They experience what Jung called emotional alchemy, transforming their self-criticism into criticism of helpers. These individuals often accuse empaths of condescension, manipulation, or superiority complexes, projecting onto helpers the very judgments they hold about themselves for needing assistance. Shame transformers frequently become increasingly hostile because they interpret empathic care as highlighting their failures or inadequacies, making the helper feel dangerous to their psychological equilibrium. The guilt reactor. Jung documented individuals who respond to help with overwhelming guilt about being burdensome, then transform this guilt into resentment toward the person triggering it. These recipients often have histories where their needs were met with martyrdom or resentment, conditioning them to associate receiving help with causing others to suffer. When empaths offer genuine care, it contradicts these expectations, creating cognitive dissonance they resolve through helper rejection. Guilt reactors may withdraw or become critical as a way of protecting empaths from their perceived burden, not realizing they're actually protecting themselves from guilt feelings. The control detector. Jung identified people who interpret empathic assistance as attempts at manipulation or control, triggering what he called freedom defense protocols. They perceive help as implicit demands for change or conformity to helpers' values. Control detectors often have histories of being manipulated through helpful behaviors, making them hypersensitive to any assistance that might come with strings attached. They may become hostile toward empaths, not because they don't appreciate the intention, but because they experience any form of care as potentially controlling. These individuals prioritize autonomy over connection, often sacrificing beneficial relationships to maintain their sense of absolute independence. The dangerous psychology of helping. Jung identified multiple psychological risks that emerge when empathic assistance triggers defensive hostility, creating what he called care contamination in human relationships. The empathic confusion crisis. Jung observed that empaths often experience profound disorientation when genuine care is met with hatred. Since their intention was purely supportive, negative responses create what he called reality questioning about their own motivations and perceptions. This confusion can be so severe that empaths begin doubting their ability to read social situations accurately, wondering if they actually are manipulative or condescending, despite conscious intentions to help. Jung documented cases where repeated helper rejection led empaths to develop what he called assistance phobia, becoming afraid to offer natural care due to conditioning that expects negative responses. The projection poisoning effect. Jung identified how empaths often absorb the shadow material projected onto them during helper rejection episodes. Recipients' accusations about manipulation or superiority can contaminate empaths' self-perception, even when factually inaccurate. Jung noted that sensitive individuals are particularly vulnerable to this shadow absorption because their empathic nature makes them naturally receptive to others' psychological material, including projections. This poisoning effect can cause empaths to suppress their natural helping instincts or become overly self-conscious about their motivations, ultimately reducing their ability to offer beneficial care. The relationship destruction pattern. Jung documented how helper rejection creates escalating dysfunction between parties. Empaths feel hurt and withdraw their natural care, while recipients feel guilty about their reaction, but don't understand its psychological source. This creates what Jung called mutual avoidance spirals, where both parties begin walking on eggshells, empaths afraid to offer support, recipients ashamed of their defensive responses. Without understanding the unconscious dynamics involved, relationships that could be mutually beneficial deteriorate into distance and suspicion. The cultural empathy erosion. Jung warned that widespread helper rejection creates societal conditioning against offering genuine care. When empathic assistance is frequently met with hostility, people learn to suppress natural helping instincts to avoid negative responses. This phenomenon contributes to social isolation and community breakdown, as individuals become hesitant to extend normal human care due to fear of triggering defensive reactions in others. Jung observed that cultures where helper rejection is common develop what he called independence pathology, extreme individualism that denies fundamental human interdependence needs. Jung's integration framework. Jung developed systematic approaches to help both empaths and recipients navigate helper rejection dynamics without destroying beneficial relationships. Projection recognition training. Jung taught recipients to identify when their negative responses to help reflect their own psychological material rather than helpers' actual behavior. This involves examining the emotional intensity of their resistance and tracing it to its psychological origins. Jung created exercises for developing what he called projection awareness, noticing when criticism of helpers feels disproportionate to their actions, identifying childhood experiences that created shame around needing assistance, and distinguishing between genuine boundary violations and personal discomfort with vulnerability. Jung emphasized that projection recognition doesn't mean accepting inappropriate help, but rather evaluating assistance based on actual behavior rather than triggered emotional responses. Conscious helping protocols. Jung developed guidelines for empaths to offer assistance in ways that minimize triggering defensive reactions. This involves what he called dignity-preserving care, providing support that enhances rather than threatens recipients' sense of competence. Specific protocols include asking permission before offering advice or assistance, framing help as collaboration rather than rescue, acknowledging recipients' existing strengths and capabilities, and respecting their right to decline assistance without taking it personally. Jung emphasized that conscious helping involves serving others' actual needs rather than empaths' unconscious needs to be needed or to solve problems. Shadow integration for recipients. Jung recognized that overcoming helper rejection requires recipients to integrate their disowned dependency and vulnerability rather than projecting it onto helpers. This process involves accepting that needing help is part of normal human experience, examining beliefs that equate receiving assistance with personal inadequacy, and developing tolerance for their own emotional needs and limitations. Jung noted that shadow integration allows recipients to receive genuine care without feeling diminished or threatened by the helper's role. Empathic boundary development. Jung taught empaths to maintain psychological separation between their own emotional material and projections from recipients experiencing helper rejection. This involves learning to evaluate feedback based on factual accuracy rather than emotional intensity, maintaining awareness of actual intentions when offering help, and developing what Jung called projection immunity that prevents absorption of others' shadow material. Jung emphasized that healthy empathy includes protecting oneself from psychological contamination while remaining open to genuine connection and care. Success stories and cautionary tales. Jung's analysis of different approaches to empathic care reveals what distinguishes successful helpers from those who trigger defensive rejection. The Rogers Model. Respect-based empathy. Fred Rogers exemplified what Jung called non-threatening empathy by consistently honoring children's inherent dignity while offering support. Rogers never positioned himself as superior to those he helped, but as a companion acknowledging their worth. Rogers' approach succeeded because he understood that genuine empathy involves respecting others' autonomy and right to their own emotional experience, even while providing care and understanding. Jung would note that Rogers avoided triggering helper rejection because his assistance came from genuine humility rather than unconscious needs to fix or save others. The Teresa paradox: service without superiority. Despite legitimate criticisms of some methods, Mother Teresa demonstrated what Jung called servant empathy, helping from genuine humility rather than perceived elevation above those served. Her approach minimized defensive reactions because she consistently positioned herself as serving rather than saving, recognizing the inherent dignity of those receiving assistance regardless of their circumstances. Jung would observe that Teresa's model shows how empathic service avoids triggering projection when it stems from authentic respect for recipients' humanity. The codependent trap: help as control. Jung documented patterns of individuals who use helping as unconscious manipulation, creating expectations of gratitude, behavioral change, or emotional dependence that recipients instinctively resist. These helpers trigger severe rejection because their assistance comes with invisible strings, unconscious demands that recipients sense and rebel against, even when unable to articulate the source of their discomfort. Jung noted that codependent helping persists despite negative responses because it serves helpers' psychological needs rather than genuinely addressing recipients' requirements. Cultural context analysis. Jung observed that individualistic cultures produce more helper rejection because they condition people to associate receiving assistance with personal failure, while interdependent cultures normalize mutual aid without threatening individual worth. Understanding these cultural dynamics helps both empaths and recipients recognize when their responses reflect social conditioning rather than personal psychology. Building helper-safe communities. Jung recognized that creating environments where empathic care can flow without triggering defensive reactions requires conscious community development and psychological education. Identifying empathy-ready individuals. Jung catalogued traits indicating someone can receive assistance without defensive responses. They acknowledge their own needs without shame, demonstrate appreciation for others' care without excessive guilt, maintain personal dignity while accepting appropriate help, and distinguish between genuine care and controlling behavior. Emotionally mature individuals understand that accepting help represents healthy interdependence rather than personal inadequacy or failure. Mutual support network design. Jung advocated for what he called reciprocal empathy systems, where everyone can give and receive support without triggering hierarchy dynamics. This involves normalizing both human strength and vulnerability, creating opportunities for mutual rather than one-sided assistance, and establishing that everyone has both resources to offer and needs to fulfill. Jung emphasized that sustainable empathic relationships require bi-directional flow of care over time, preventing the power imbalances that often trigger defensive responses. Community psychological education. Jung recommended that groups develop empathy intelligence, understanding the unconscious dynamics that make giving and receiving care psychologically challenging for many people. This includes education about projection mechanisms, recognition of helper rejection as self-protection rather than personal attack, and development of cultural norms supporting both healthy independence and appropriate interdependence. Dignity preserving assistance systems. Jung advocated for help structures that minimize triggering defensive responses by maintaining recipients' autonomy and self-respect. This involves offering rather than imposing assistance, providing help that enhances rather than diminishes recipients' capabilities, and respecting others' right to decline help without interpreting refusal as personal rejection. Jung noted that sustainable empathic care requires understanding that sometimes the most caring response is allowing others to handle their own challenges rather than rushing to provide solutions. The journey from rejection to understanding. Jung documented predictable stages both empaths and recipients experience when learning to navigate helper-rejection dynamics constructively. Empath evolution, confusion to clarity. Jung observed empaths typically begin feeling hurt and bewildered by negative responses to genuine care attempts. Recognition involves understanding that helper rejection often reflects recipients' unconscious psychology rather than empaths' actual behavior. Next comes motivation archaeology. Empaths examine their own unconscious needs to be needed, to fix problems, or to maintain helper identities through their caring behaviors. Integration involves developing what Jung called unattached compassion, maintaining genuine care while not taking responsibility for managing others' discomfort with receiving assistance. Finally, empaths learn to offer help in ways that preserve recipients' dignity, reducing defensive triggers while honoring their natural caring disposition. Recipient evolution, defense to acceptance. Jung documented that people struggling with helper rejection typically begin with automatic defensive responses, without awareness of underlying psychological dynamics. Recognition involves understanding their negative reactions often reflect conditioning about dependency and vulnerability, rather than accurate assessment of helpers' intentions. Integration includes examining childhood experiences that created shame around needing help, developing tolerance for their own vulnerability, and learning to evaluate assistance based on appropriateness rather than emotional triggers. Final integration involves gracefully receiving genuine care while maintaining healthy boundaries against inappropriate assistance. Relationship transformation process. Jung noted that relationships affected by helper rejection can evolve toward healthier dynamics when both parties understand the unconscious mechanisms involved. This evolution includes open discussion about helper rejection phenomena, clear communication about assistance preferences, and development of mutual empathy, where both parties can give and receive support appropriately. If you've learned to see rejection of your help as psychological protection rather than personal attack, comment, "Understanding freed me from taking it personally." Common integration mistakes. Jung identified traps that prevent successful navigation of helper rejection dynamics, warning about approaches that worsen rather than resolve these interpersonal challenges. The analysis paralysis trap. Jung warned against empaths becoming so focused on psychological dynamics that they lose spontaneous caring capacity. Over-intellectualizing empathy makes it feel calculated rather than authentic. While understanding projection mechanisms helps, empaths shouldn't become so self-conscious about potential negative responses that they suppress natural caring instincts entirely. Balance requires maintaining psychological awareness while preserving authentic emotional expression. The wounded withdrawal pattern. Jung observed empaths responding to helper rejection with defensive withdrawal, removing their care as protection or punishment toward those who didn't appreciate their assistance. This withdrawal often stems from injured pride rather than conscious boundary setting, creating mutual avoidance cycles that damage potentially beneficial relationships. Healthy responses involve maintaining internal equilibrium rather than reactive withdrawal of genuine concern. The binary thinking trap. Jung warned against empaths swinging from unlimited helping to no assistance at all, interpreting any negative response as evidence they should never offer help again. This all-or-nothing thinking deprives both empaths and others of beneficial connection, often reflecting cognitive rigidity rather than nuanced understanding of interpersonal dynamics. Jung advocated for sophisticated responses that distinguish between inappropriate helping and genuine care, offered with respect for others' autonomy. The projection internalization error. Jung identified empaths who absorb projected material during helper rejection, beginning to believe they actually are manipulative or inappropriately motivated in their desire to help. This internalization damages empaths' self-perception and confidence in offering assistance that could genuinely benefit others. Developing projection discrimination allows empaths to distinguish between valid behavioral feedback and shadow material being projected by others. The greater purpose. Jung believed understanding helper rejection serves crucial functions in collective psychological development, contributing to more mature empathic relationships throughout society. When helper rejection dynamics are understood, communities develop healthier patterns of mutual support that honor both individual autonomy and interdependence needs. This creates what Jung called collective empathy intelligence, cultural capacity for sustainable caring relationships. Relationship model evolution. Jung observed that individuals successfully navigating helper rejection become examples of healthier empathic dynamics, showing others that care can be exchanged without triggering defensive responses or creating unhealthy dependencies. These evolved relationships demonstrate that genuine empathy involves respecting autonomy while offering support, maintaining dignity while acknowledging vulnerability, and creating mutual rather than hierarchical care exchanges. Cultural healing catalyst. Jung noted that understanding these dynamics challenges cultural conditioning that damages both empaths' ability to give care and recipients' capacity to receive it constructively. This awareness contributes to cultural maturation around interdependence, moving beyond independence mythology toward recognition that mutual care is essential for human thriving. Psychological growth acceleration. Jung emphasized that working through helper rejection forces both empaths and recipients to confront unconscious material that might otherwise remain unexamined, catalyzing individual development and relationship maturity. This process, while initially challenging, strengthens both parties' capacity for authentic connection and reduces projection dynamics that create interpersonal conflict. The freedom in understanding. Understanding why empaths feel hate from people they've only helped reveals fundamental truths about human psychology that transform confusion into clarity. This phenomenon isn't evidence of empathic failure or recipient ingratitude, but predictable results of unconscious shadow dynamics and projection mechanisms governing human interaction. When empaths offer genuine assistance, they often trigger shame, wounded pride, and dependency fears in recipients who haven't integrated their own vulnerability and interdependence needs. The resulting hostility reflects internal psychological struggles rather than accurate assessment of empaths' character or intentions. For empaths, recognizing these dynamics provides freedom from personalizing defensive responses to genuine care. Understanding projection mechanisms allows maintaining natural empathy while developing appropriate boundaries against absorbing others' disowned psychological material. For recipients, awareness of helper rejection patterns offers opportunity to examine conditioning around vulnerability and receiving care, potentially freeing them from automatic defensive responses that damage beneficial relationships. Jung's insights reveal both parties can grow through understanding these dynamics. Recipients learning to accept assistance without threats to dignity and autonomy. Your empathic nature remains valuable precisely because it penetrates psychological defenses and connects with authentic human needs, even when that connection initially triggers defensive responses. The goal isn't eliminating helper rejection, but understanding it as information about unconscious processes rather than evidence of personal failure. If you felt confused by someone's hostility after you genuinely tried to help them, comment, "I understand it wasn't really about me." Your recognition of these shadow dynamics helps free both yourself and others from unconscious projection patterns that damage potentially beneficial relationships. Thanks for watching. See you in the next dimension.